Hello, everyone. We hope you're doing well out there in History Land. I'm Glenn with the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I'm very pleased to bring you this Friday members-only live stream about the Olympics, the nutshell history of the Olympics. So we are in the midst of summer now, and as we are recording this, the Olympic Games are still going on in Tokyo in 2020. But we've gotten a lot of requests to sort of just give an overview of what the Olympics are, where they came from, how far back they go, and so we are, of course, happy to oblige. At its most basic level, the Olympics come from Greece, from Mount Olympus, which, according Hello, everyone. We hope you're doing well out there in History Land. I'm Glenn with the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I'm very pleased to bring you this Friday members-only live stream about the Olympics, the nutshell history of the Olympics. So we are in the midst of summer now, and as we are recording this, the Olympic Games are still going on in Tokyo in 2020. But we've gotten a lot of requests to sort of just give an overview of what the Olympics are, where they came from, how far back they go, and so we are, of course, happy to oblige. At its most basic level, the Olympics come from Greece, from Mount Olympus, which, according Hello, everyone. We hope you're doing well out there in History Land. I'm Glenn with the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I'm very pleased to bring you this Friday members-only live stream about the Olympics, the nutshell history of the Olympics. So we are in the midst of summer now, and as we are recording this, the Olympic Games are still going on in Tokyo in 2020. But we've gotten a lot of requests to sort of just give an overview of what the Olympics are, where they came from, how far back they go, and so we are, of course, happy to oblige. At its most basic level, the Olympics come from Greece, from Mount Olympus, which, according to mythology, is where the Greek gods, most of the Greek gods, made their home, and it is an actual physical place, Mount Olympus, in Greece. You can see it on this picture behind me. And because it became such an important part of Greek religion and Greek celebration, a town, actually a more or less a city, formed at the base, close to the base of Mount Olympus, called Olympia. And this was something that the Greeks began to work together to have these games. And it's very interesting when you start studying the ancient Greeks. They are hyper competitive. Right? Their culture is hyper-competitive. They want to be the best at things. And so part of that is what drove the competition from the Olympic Games. Each one of the cities, the city-states, would send competitors to take part in these games at Olympus, at Olympia. And so they began to do it every 4 years, and a 4-year period was called an Olympiad. And so that is where we get the tradition of having the Olympics take place every 4 years. And on this next slide, you can see, we don't unfortunately have an exact picture. We don't have color photographs of ancient Olympia, but we do have this model, this rendering of what Olympia might have looked like. And you can see there are a lot of very permanent structures made at the base of Mount Olympus. And one of the ones here that's the big white one is basically the Temple of Zeus. Again, Zeus is the chief of the gods, and of course, Zeus Olympus is the idea that Zeus is the king of the gods, and this is why the games were held at Olympus, because within the Greek pantheon, it was considered that Zeus was the one who gave athletes their strength, their speed, their flexibility, their talents, their athletic ability comes from Zeus. And so as a result, the athletic games are held at Zeus's big place, Olympus and Olympia. So in this next slide, you can see The ruins that exist from Olympia. This, we think, is probably from one of the main buildings. It may even be from the main temple structure. But these columns have been here 2,500 years or so. And, this is all we have to go by. But Zeus is really the great one, right? He is the one who gives the athletes their strength, their ability. And so in the next slide, you see a statue of what would have been in the main Zeus temple, Zeus Olympus. And this was considered one of the ancient wonders of the world. You can see with the scale of the people standing next to it, this statue was absolutely huge. And this is the main point of religion, the main point of worship for Zeus, which is why the Olympic Games are held here, because it is Zeus who grants the athletes their virility, their strength, their speed, their athletic ability in general. And so this is why it comes together at the foot of Mount Olympus. Well, what kind of games did they have in ancient Greece? You can see on the next slide, courtesy of our friends at Encyclopedia Britannica, sort of just a brief graphic overview of what the main games were. Not nearly the breadth and depth of games that we have in the modern Olympics, but they were very, very closely followed. You have, of course, the discus throw. All of these, with the exception of chariot racing, unfortunately, we generally still keep in the modern Olympic Games. The discus throw, the long jump, and if you can see a little bit in this graphic here, the fellow has like these things in his hands that were actually weights. And the idea was that you would take off and run with the extra weight and then chuck the weights as you took off so that you would be lighter to go further, but the weights were supposed to give you some momentum. So we have the long jump. We have the javelin throw, which is throwing spears. Who can do that the furthest? The chariot races, and I want to come back to those in a second. There's some interesting details. There were several different foot races. Some of them were for rapid speed. Some of them were they didn't use meters, but about 1,500 meters. And one of the ones that I like is the foot race was supposed to take place in full armor, in the helmet, the shield, the sword, the spear, the bronze greaves, the sandals, and they were to have a race in full armor to see who could do that the fastest. This takes place, as they do now, in the summer, in the heat of Greece. This has got to be one of the most exhausting events that the ancient Greeks could take part in. There are also a couple of combatant games. There's boxing, which is, you can see the image there. They're actually, striking the face. And wrestling, which is where, they're trying to throw and pin their opponent. They have to get their opponent's hip or shoulder to touch the ground 3 times, and that's how they win. And then the last one, which is basically the Greek version of ultimate fighting. The only rules were you couldn't gouge eyes and you couldn't bite. But other than that, anything goes, and basically you won by making the other person not able to continue, whether they gave up, whether they were knocked unconscious or something like that. So you can see these games are very physical and very competitive. Now, chariot racing. Chariot racing is interesting because this was primarily the realm of the wealthy. It took a lot of wealth in ancient Greece to have 4 or 2, depending upon which version, quick horses and the chariot and the charioteer, the racer. And what's interesting about the chariot race is, unlike all the other games, the person who won was not the person who actually rode in or drove the horses, but the one who owned the team. So if you were very rich, you could actually enter more than one team into the Olympics. And this happened very frequently. There was one fellow named Alcibiades who was so wealthy that he entered and he got 3 out of 4 places, 1st, 2nd, and 4th, because it was his teams that won. So you could win multiple times in chariot racing, and again, whoever invested the money are the ones who were given the victory. Now, in the next slide, you're going to see some original images from statuary and Greek vases of runners, of discus throwers there at the top. We have in the middle there on the left, the long jump. You can see, again, those weights in the hand. And you have more running. You can see they're really getting in there. This isn't something where they're sort of keeping distance from each other. They're probably elbowing and trying to get in there and get into this muddle and see who can get there the fastest. And then on the bottom you have a stone carving of some wrestling that's going on. Now, in the next slide, we have at the top that chariot racing, right? This is an actual image of the chariot race, and you can see this is two horses. The guy's sort of sitting down in the chariot. The chariot is very light. It's little more than a chair with wheels because speed is, of course, the key. And at the bottom, you have an event that eventually came about called the pentathlon, 5 athletic events. The long jump, the javelin, the discus, some wrestling, and a running event. So all those would be put together, and that would be the pentathlon. Well, what were some of the details of these games? In the next slide, you can see some of the basic facts. They began, as far as we can tell, in 776 BC. And that's a pretty long time. That's according to Aristotle. Most people have adopted that, and some archaeological evidence of Olympia tends to show that it's right around that time when the Olympic Games probably began. Remember, they're very tied in from a religious aspect. In effect, participating in the games is an act of, perhaps not worship isn't the right word, but of honoring the gods, of taking part in a religious event, a religious ceremony, to show off the gifts that the gods granted one. And who could compete? Only male citizens, no women, with the exception of the chariot race. If a woman was rich enough to enter some chariots, she could become a winner in the Olympics because her team had won. But generally speaking, this is all male, and these are free citizens. Slaves could not compete. The medics, the outside, the foreigners from Greece could not compete. This was very, very exclusive. And what's interesting is there were punishments if you cheated or if you broke the rules. And I'm not talking about disqualification. I'm talking about if you were caught cheating, they would pull you to the side and they would take a whip and they would whip you. Pretty interesting. As I said, they were very competitive, and anyone who broke the rules was breaching that natural baseline competitiveness, and they could certainly pay the price for that. It's also interesting that in the ancient Greek games, for each event, there was only one award, first place. Nothing else really mattered except for the chariot races, because those people who had invested their money needed something to show. But the discus throw, the races, all those things, there was only the first place. What did they receive? They literally received laurels. Today, we say that, that we grant them laurels with their renown and things like that. They would get basically just some fig leaves or some olive laurels that they would wear on their head. Now, what they also got was bragging rights, because everyone in Greece knew who had won these events. And so the different cities would have their champions. And if a city's athlete won this game, they would instill it, they would inscribe it on stone, and everyone who won at the Olympic Games had the right to put up a statue of themselves at Olympia. Of course, only the wealthy could do this, or those who wanted to show off. So, for example, Athens, which was probably the richest city, most of its athletes, even if the athletes couldn't afford a statue or a stone stele there, Athens itself would pay to have that up. So eventually at Olympia, there were hundreds and hundreds of statues and obelisks there to put on display. And competition was in the nude. This is probably one of the reasons that women were not allowed to compete. Of course, you have to remember that in ancient Greece, women were not citizens. They were not free. This is not to say that this somehow made the Greeks backwards. In 2,500 years ago, this was pretty much the status quo everywhere in the world. So this is not unusual. This is merely us looking back. But the fact that they competed in the nude, and you can see this in all the artwork, it sort of made sure that there was no cheating. I'm not sure how they thought you could hide some performance-enhancing thing under your Greek clothing, but nevertheless, they wanted to show off their physique, right? This is about competition, and this is about impressing people. Now, the Greeks, this was very important to the Greeks, the Olympics, and so they would keep these going even in times of war. They would even have truces between warring city-states so that their champions could go and compete in the Olympic Games. As Greece sort of went downhill from the Golden Age and eventually they were conquered by Rome, the Romans allowed them to do it, but the popularity and participation in the games tended to go downhill from about the 4th century and the 3rd century all the way down. And so during the Roman occupation, things didn't go. The Romans thought it was quaint. They kind of let them do it. One of the Roman emperors took that beautiful statue of Zeus Olympus that I had told you about, melted down the gold from it, used it to finance some of his wars. And finally, it shifts on into the AD portion, and until 394 AD, they did still have Olympic Games. But at that point, one of the Christianized emperors, whose name I can't remember, said he outlawed basically pagan rites and rituals. And as a result, since the Olympic Games were so closely tied to Greek religion, they were in effect outlawed. Now, there were some of these activities, some of these games that took place in Greece and around the Greek-speaking world after that, but there were no Olympics. There was no competition at the foot of Mount Olympus for a long, long time, right? Until you get to two men whose picture is in the next slide. These two men basically made the modern Olympic Games, and you see how far we've gone since then. It's 1,500 years between the ending of the Olympic Games proper and when the modern Olympic Games began. The modern Olympic Games begin in 1896. I'm going to have to read you these names so that I can make sure I get them right. There was a Frenchman who was fascinated with the idea of the Olympics, who had studied them, who considered sport a way to enhance one's personal ability and role within society, right? A fit person is going to be just a better citizen, as the Greeks thought. His name was Pierre de Coubertin. And Pierre was the one who really pushed to have an opportunity for all these countries, instead of just Greek city-states, why not have all the nations of the world participate? And so he thought it would be very, very good marketing as well as very spiritual to have these modern games in the home of the Olympic Games in Greece. There were not the facilities at Mount Olympus anymore, so they decided to have it in the capital of Greece, Athens. And Athens, of course, very much got behind this, and the Greek fellow who really formed chaired the first committee for these first modern Olympic Games is Evangelos Zappos. And so these two in 1896 held the first Olympic Games. And as you can see in the next slide, this is at Athens. This is at the, it's not a Coliseum, it's not really a theater or an amphitheater. It was a place called the Panathinaikos, where the Panathenia, the celebration of Athens, would take place. And so they decided to have the first opening ceremonies here in Athens in 1896. And you can see this photograph. We'll come back to this in a second and sort of compare this first opening ceremonies to some of the ones we've seen since. At that first Olympics, there were 241 athletes representing 14 nations. Not super huge, but the idea that this was happening sort of pulled a lot of people in. And this is where you get some of the things we associate with the Olympics now were invented for the modern Olympic Games. They did not exist in the ancient games. For example, on the next slide, you can see the lighting of the torch and the torch relay. This is something that Coubertin had thought of would be a great idea. And so at the ancient ruined site of Olympia, every time there's an Olympics, they have this cauldron that supposedly you put the torch in, and the rays from the sun at Olympia light the torch. They light this flame. And then the torch leaves from there. Of course, in the first games, all they had to do was go there to the Panathinaikos. But since then, they have to have that flame travel anywhere the Olympics are being held. And we're talking thousands and thousands of miles, right? And each host city tends to design their own version of the torch. And up at the top, you can see how some of those designs have changed over the years. That's one of the things that makes each Olympics unique, is how the host city is able to design those torches. Now, the image we've got here only goes back to 1936, but there were different designs of torches at first, but it wasn't until about the 1920s when they decided to put a lot of effort into designing these torches. And, so these modern Olympics start with the torch bearing. That was not in ancient Greek. Something else that this is surprising to some that was not in the ancient Greek Olympics was the marathon. You can see in the next slide the winner of the first marathon as an Olympic event. Again, I'm going to look at this because I don't want to mess up his name. Spiridon Lewis, who is a water carrier, who was Greek himself. This is one of those interesting stories because even though the first modern Olympics were held in Greece, the Greeks actually didn't do very well, and they didn't win in any single event except for the marathon, which had been invented for the modern Olympic Games in Greece. The ancient Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC, and a fellow named Phidippides had to run from there all the way to Athens to tell the Athenians that they had won, a distance of 26.2 miles. And so they said, well, what if we just repeat this? And this race can be, we'll call it the marathon. The first one actually did go from Marathon to Athens, that distance. And this, I can't run, I can barely run 2 miles. Certainly can't run 26.2. But this Greek water carrier won the first marathon, and he became an unspeakably huge hero to the Greeks. He was granted jewelry. He got fancy things like a free haircut in a barbershop for life and new clothes and all these sorts of things. But the marathon was not an ancient Greek event. It is very, very modern. Well, what sort of other events do we have in the modern games? This next slide will show you some of them. And these are some of the more traditional ones, but there are lots. And it sort of changes based on what the International Olympic Committee wants to do. Now, let me back up for just a second and say that the International Olympic Committee has actually existed since the beginning of the modern Olympic Games. Zappas, who I had the photo of recently, was the first chairman of the IOC for the 1896 Games, but after that it was Coubertin. He ceded the honor of the first to a Greek, and then with the second modern Olympic Games, he took over as the chair of the IOC and sat in that position for quite some time. And the IOC really sets the guidelines, what competitive events, where the host city will be, and things like that. We'll come back to the IOC a little bit later. But the core of this summer event stays the same, and additions have been made over time. They wanted to incorporate as many of those ancient games as they could. There's still wrestling, there's still boxing, discus throw, javelin, long jumps, running competitions. No chariot races, though, unfortunately. It's too bad. But equestrian events are indeed in there. They do have horse racing and things like that. So, it's interesting. After the first modern Olympic Games, people were like, yay, that's neat. And then 4 years later, they sort of lost interest from 1900. And then interest sort of waned until about the 1920s. In the 1920s, after World War I, people began to look for ways for countries to come back together, for countries to sort of compete, and nations to take part in something that theoretically would foster a spirit of unity and cooperation. So the Olympics picked back up. And in the next slide, you'll see that some other things have been added to the Olympics since then. Most of what I've been talking about so far is the Summer Olympics, but they did add the Winter Olympics in 1924 in Paris. And eventually, at first it was the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics were going to be the same year. Well, they began to realize that is a lot of work. And so they began to stagger them. So it's Winter Olympics 2 years, Summer Olympics 2 years, Winter Olympics 2 years. So each one is still an Olympiad, is still 4 years. But they do separate it out, and that has pulled in a lot of different events that were not remotely in ancient Greece, but are very, very interesting and focused on those winter activities. The Paralympics also started a little bit later. They sort of started right after World War II when some people wanted disabled veterans of World War II to be able to compete athletically, and so they put this together. And the Paralympics did eventually take place in 1968. And part of the Paralympics eventually became, with the International Olympic Committee, decided that whoever hosts and puts in for the Summer Olympics, the Paralympics go along with them. So, for example, in Atlanta in 1996, you have the Paralympics and you have the real Olympics, and whoever gets one gets both. And so the Paralympics have continued to be a part of the Olympic spirit and the Olympic process. So Winter Olympics, Paralympics, part of the International Olympic Committee process. So what are some other things that they do in the modern Olympics? Well, probably the most famous, the most iconic are the first, second, and third place winners. You can see in this next slide that has become something. So we recognize not just the first place, but the second and the third. And we do that with gold and silver and bronze medals. And usually the medals are gold and silver and bronze, or at least a version or an alloy of those medals. And the idea being that the winner of the event is in the center podium, and then to their right is the second place, and then to their left is the third place. And the ceremonies have those people, they'll come on the podium, they will be given their medal, and then the respective national anthem of the winner will play, and then the other two national anthems will play as well. Now, the podiums have to be, that's something that you can see from the picture on the bottom, that's sort of how it goes for individual events. If there are team events, such as this photograph of the 1980 U.S. hockey team, the podiums are going to have to be a little bit bigger because they're going to have the entire team up there. And the podium design is also something that's really, really interesting and really focused on how each host city wants to have their look and their design. Now, what happens with the incorporation of national anthems, with the incorporation of placing, of course, things can start to be a little bit political when you have lots of different nations participating. And the next slide shows one of the most interesting juxtapositions in modern history for that. In the 1936 Olympic Games, which were hosted in Berlin, you can see that if you know your history, you know that in 1936, Hitler's Nazi regime was in total control of Germany, and this was their effort to sort of show, look, Berlin and Germany have come back from World War I. We're a powerful state. We're economically prosperous. Everyone is happy here. And so in that picture on the left, you can see they're preparing to light the main Olympic torch there in Berlin, but they're having to run into the Olympic Stadium in Berlin with all those Nazi banners and the swastikas and things like that. And this was, among other things, Hitler thought it would be his chance to not only show that Germany was ascendant, but that the Aryan race was ascendant, and he intended for all of his athletes to do very, very well and hopefully sweep the Olympics. Well, the U.S. just likes to cause trouble, and so Jesse Owens was one of those participants in the 1936 Olympic Games, and one of the most famous photos you can see there on the right when he won a couple of different medals, but one of the great ones of this is, here's Jesse Owens, an African-American who the Germans certainly considered lesser human than the Aryans, had just won. And so in third place is one of Hitler's perfect Aryans who is giving the Nazi salute on the podium there. So much for the Supermen and the super race, but there's Jesse Owens winning, giving the salute as that plays. In the next slide, you're going to see another very interesting juxtaposition that takes place in the 1968 games, speaking of podiums, because the podiums then become, as people saw in 1936 and moving forward, the podiums really sort of become a literal platform for expression of political thought, of political ideas and things like that. So in 1968, at the height of racial tensions in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, this is one of the most famous photographs from this period. And you can see here, you've got Peter Norman, who's there. I'm going from left to right. You've got Peter Norman, Tommy Smith, and John Carlos. Tommy Smith and John Carlos had won the event, had gotten first and third in the event. And there was very much an attitude at this time that they wanted to express equal rights and human rights. And so they made the decision to, when they were being awarded their medals, to put their hands up in the Black Power expression, both of them, and bow their heads during the national anthem. And it's interesting, lots of people have seen this. Lots of people have considered this very courageous. They were immediately kicked out of the Olympics. They were immediately kicked off the U.S. Olympic team, and they spent the rest of their lives sort of in a hero slash villain, depending upon how you viewed their participation, a hero slash villain lifestyle. But an interesting story is that poor white guy there on the left, whose name was Peter Norman. He was an Australian. And as an Australian, he also had very strong beliefs in equal rights. And so you can see every one of those athletes, if you look closely, they all have a little silver circle on their uniform, on their jumpers. That's the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And that was a badge that they had all worn, is an expression of this. So Norman is sitting there as the national anthems play. He doesn't know what's going on behind him, but he actually agrees with these guys. And he also, when the Australian Olympic Committee saw that he had worn that badge in protest of racial inequality in Australia, he was kicked off their Olympic team. He went back and was just excoriated in the press and ended up having a very rough life in Australia, and ends up dying in 2006, where these other two gentlemen serve as his pallbearers. So that entire podium there, even though it looks like someone is not agreeing with the Black Power gesture, there's actually quite a bit of unity going on that podium. Which brings us to some of the other aspects of the modern games. The next slide has some of these. Other than sport, there are a lot of politics and economics that tie into the modern Olympic Games, and always have. This is sort of unfortunate. We want so badly to focus on athletic prowess and athletic competition and athletic achievement, and there's a lot of that going on, and you can see the hopes and the joys in a lot of these people when they're competing, that they're doing something that they don't normally get to do. Unfortunately, we don't have massive professional sports built around discus throwing and javelins and pentathlons. This is really their only venue to compete and to excel, is the Olympics. But the Olympics, really since their beginning, but especially starting in the 1930s, 40s, and post-World War II, have become political and economic focal points. And that's especially expressed during the Cold War. With the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower after World War II in the United States, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't go to war, but they were still very much ideologically opposed. And rather than go to war, the Olympics became a way where they could compete. They could show which system was best based on who got the most medals. And so competition in the Olympics between the two countries became less about individual athletic prowess and more about political and ideological competition, somehow as though if more of our athletes won, we were going to be better than you. Both communist and Western countries would host the Olympics, and to show their political wills, oftentimes they would boycott. Many countries boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in the Soviet Union. When the Olympic Games moved to the United States in 1984, the Soviet Union boycotted those, and several other countries around the world did not come. So the boycotts also became something. And so individual expression of politics from the podium, national level of political expression based on ideologies also takes place at the Olympics every 4 years. There is also an incredible pressure for cities when they're bidding to be host cities to show that they're going to be the best, to spend a lot of money for marketing campaigns. Why do cities want the Olympics? There are a few reasons. First of all, there is, as in the ancient Greek games, the prestige of having the world come to your doorstep and stay there with you, and all of the world's attention is focused on your city. That's pretty cool. But the hope is also that it's going to provide a lot of economic income and a lot of infrastructure improvement. If you're getting the Olympics, you're going to need to fix your public transit system. You're going to need to build new athletic facilities. You're going to have new restaurants pop up, all the infrastructure to support the Olympic Games. That costs a lot of money, right? Some people say it costs, we can host the Olympics, it'll be $4, $5, $6 billion. Well, I think the Beijing Olympics cost the equivalent of $20 billion. So it becomes an incredibly expensive prospect. And how much does that actually benefit the local citizens and the businesses that are in that area? There's so much cost that goes into hosting the Olympics. And probably one of the most troublesome things is very much to support the cost of the Olympics is the commercialization of the Olympics. When the Olympics are coming around, there's all kinds of official drink, official Coke, official flip-flop, official string of the Olympics, because you can pay money to the Olympics to put that logo on to maybe sell more of your products. This happens with television shows, with product placement, with everything. Because the increasing expense requires increasing money, where are they going to get that money? It's also interesting that even if a host city is able to make a lot of money from the Olympic Games, the way the contracts read with the International Olympic Committee gets huge payouts from the host city and from all the licensing and things like that come from an Olympiad every 4 years. So there is a lot of money changes hands. And so that, again, tends to take the focus off of the athletes. But when we're all sitting at home and we're all rooting for our country and watching these stories of people doing their best and getting knocked down and rising up, they can still serve as human inspiration. There is still a strong spirit of competitiveness. There is still the desire to celebrate athletic ability, the likes of which most of the world never sees. And we get to watch it on our television screens, right? We get to watch some of the most amazing, talented, coordinated, strong athletes in the world, both men and women in the modern games. And that can bring us all perhaps a little bit closer and still fulfill the purpose of the original Olympic Games in 1896 and the original Olympic Games back in ancient Greece. And this next to last slide shows the most recent opening ceremonies in Tokyo in 2020. We have come a long way. There are tens of thousands of people that attend these opening ceremonies. The opening and closing ceremonies become one of the focal points of any Olympics, a time for any host city to really show off how the torch can be lit. The one I will remember is at the Barcelona Olympics. They lit the torch with a bow and arrow shot from about 100 yards away. You should look that up on YouTube. It is a fantastic thing, and it's hard to top that, and no one really can. No one really has yet, in my personal opinion. But how far the Olympics have come from the ruins of Olympia to, and this last slide sort of gives you a juxtaposition of the first opening of the modern Olympic Games in 1896 and the recent Tokyo opening in 2020. What is the future of the Olympics? It's probably bright. Even though they cost a lot of money and they can be financial sinkholes, some of the national politics has gone away, which has allowed individuals to focus more on the athletic competition and a lot of these neat things. And with our access now on the internet and lots of cable channels, those of us who are interested in some of the more obscure events, I don't know, say like fencing or equestrian events, you can still watch all those rather than the more popular marathons or things like that. And one of the great things, then I'll use this to tie everything up, the modern Olympics really are about amateur athletes, right? Most of the Olympians at the Olympics are not paid professional athletes. It's not what they do for a living. It's what they do on their own time. Very much the way the ancient Greeks were. There were no professional athletes in ancient Greeks. These were all citizens. Now, they would exercise every day. They would, improve their bodies. They lived in that incredibly hot climate. Almost every Greek person was incredibly physically fit, but they were not paid to be athletes. They received no financial reward from it. Same thing modern day. Now, some of the more popular athletes may go on to get endorsement deals that are a good bit of money, but the actual act of competition, the actual athletic activity itself, they do for the joy of the sport. They do for competition, and they do to see if they can be the best. And that, if nothing else, ties them very, very closely to those first Olympians all the way back in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. That is a nutshell of the Olympics. There's a lot more we could talk about, especially in the modern era, but we are going to go ahead and say goodbye. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation on the Olympics. We want to thank you all for being members. As always, your membership is what helps us succeed and continue to grow here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. We couldn't do it without you, so thank you for all of your support. And until we see you again at the History Center, stay safe and take care.